I hope you're all well. I'm just here to introduce the introducer who will introduce the speaker. So welcome to Victoria, where the Western Society for French History is having its 48th annual conference. This is very exciting. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't take a moment to thank the many sponsors of this event at the University of Victoria, the Department of History, the Department of French, European Studies Program, and Faculty of Humanities and Faculty of Graduate Studies. At Penn State, I was floored by the actual thousands of dollars my departments of French and Francophone Studies, History, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies poured into allowing us to keep registration costs as low as possible for graduate students and other people in need of subventions, which was an amazing stepping up of my programs. Yeah. But mostly I'm just up here to name a few people. Jill, our local organizer. Jill is an associate professor of history at the University of Victoria and a French historian, of course. Jill is also this conference's phenomenal local organizer. Most conference local organizers spend about 2 years in marathon mode and a few months in sprint mode. Jill has been working on this conference on and off for almost 5 years now, from the initial seed, the first planting of the Victoria seed in the Western's conference mind, to this current moment. In that time, this conference was almost presided over by two other presidents, Leslie Tuttle and Christy Pekikaro, the current past president, and the past president. But the COVID-19 pandemic decided otherwise. And in organizations such as ours, which depends entirely upon people donating not just their skill sets, but also their time to the Western, executive officers such as myself are greatly helped by the ways their predecessors have paved the way. My way to this conference was well paved by Leslie and Christy both, and also made easier by the sound of advice of my wonderful vice president, your rising president, Andrew Ross. And and by the amazing governing council members, the entire governing council, but especially those who stepped onto the program committee, Christina Carroll, Jim Coons, Corinne Gressing, and Rachel Jean-Baptiste, or who helped put together mentoring and engagé events for this conference, like Miranda Sachs, Nick Underwood, and Emily Marker, your rising vice president as of yesterday. My way was made a lot easier by our phenomenal, long-serving, outgoing treasurer, Eric Thompson, as well as our incoming treasurer, Catherine Clark, and our tireless co-treasurer and general person of Western goodwill, Naomi Andrews. I started my work as president with Jonathan Briggs as secretary, but you also have received many a message from me these past few weeks thanks to our new secretary, Terry Peterson, who also designed this year's program template. So thank you, Terry. Finally, we are so thankful to the student workers who did everything from man the registration and book tables to stuff your registration packets. They are Dax Tate, Natasha Dany, Caitlin Humber, Connor White, and Kristen Fontaine. But it is Jill alone. Actually, I should say that's something that Jill was also doing yesterday, and me a little less, mostly Jill. But it is Jill alone who selected the food, the drink, the venue, and Jill who exchanged at this point countless emails with me and my fellow officers to pull this off and make it the truly fabulous event that it is. It's been a very real honor and a pleasure, this is true, to be able to help her in any way I could from way over in the East Coast. We found a solution to every single crisis, one just 5 minutes ago, big or small, and we've done it very efficiently indeed. So please join me in a massive round of applause, possibly a standing ovation if you are up for standing, for all those I've just named, but most especially for Jill Walshaw. And now the floor is yours, Jill.
I know, you're really just applauding the food, aren't you? Well, Jennifer stole my thunder a little bit. I had almost all the same thank yous to do to the students, to the hotel staff, to the culinary staff, and to all of the team that I've been working with, so thank you very much. Welcome to Victoria. I've been waiting a very long time to say that. I've been very happy all along, though, to hear how excited people were to come to Victoria. And I know that it's a little bit far away. I know it's on an island. I got at least one email from somebody who said, "I'm in Vancouver, is it far to the hotel?" And I thought, uh-oh, I have some bad news for you. You're a little ways away still. So I've heard lots of stories of difficult travel arrangements and delayed flights and fog and rerouted things and late arrivals, and I just want you to know how grateful we are that you all made the effort to come here to our beautiful island. And I've also heard lots about how beautiful you think it is here, despite the fact that it's raining. So that's really good news. I appreciate that. I do apologize for the weather. As I think I sent out in an email, it was unseasonably hot about 2 weeks ago, drying out the trees, drying up the salmon runs, you know, completely unseasonable for October hot. So to be perfectly honest, we are all doing nip-ups right now that this is the weather that's supposed to be in November and that we're getting the rain that we need. So try to embrace the rain, as, you know, this is the wet coast and this is why it's temperate rainforest. So get out an umbrella and enjoy the fresh smell outside. That said, it's supposed to be sunny tomorrow. So enjoy the sun coming through into your sessions. Okay? I won't take up very much more time. I just wanted to make a couple of small announcements. First of all, thinking of the food, their model in the kitchen is constant replenishment. So if it looks like there's not a lot of food out for a snack, don't be shy, because as soon as that's gone, they're going to bring another platter, okay? Next, for our Zoom participants tomorrow, if you just have a regular panel, please try to get all your presentations on one laptop. It makes it go a lot faster. If you are a Zoom participant, please make sure that the Zoom account holder can log in on that laptop that all of your presentations are on. Test it in advance. Okay, we have fairly short panels at 90 minutes, so as much as you can do to get there 10 minutes in advance, make sure that it's all working. It'll solve any problems that we might have. And lastly, if you haven't noticed, there's note space at the back of your programs. So if you're scribbling on napkins and things like that, flip to the back of your program and you'll find some note space. So it has been a great day, a great first main day of our conference. Lots of great papers, of seeing old friends, of making new connections, which is just what we love about in-person conferences, right? And we have another great day tomorrow to look forward to. But first, a highlight of our conference, our keynote speaker. So I'm going to bring Robin Waltz up here, who's going to introduce Matt Matsuda. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure to introduce this evening's keynote speaker, Matt Matsuda. He is professor of history at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. He's the founder and previously the dean of the Honors College on the New Brunswick campus, and currently director of the Gardner Fellows Program at Rutgers University. In 2013, I was wrapping up a third year on the Council of the Pacific Coast branch of the American Historical Association. That's a society that has an emphasis in American Western history, but not exclusively so. The Pacific Coast branch met in Denver that summer, and to my surprise, Matt Matsuda was on the program in a session on Pacific histories. I knew Matt as a cultural and intellectual historian of France, author of The Memory of the Modern, and I'd met him at annual meetings of this society where he cut an impressive figure, articulate, soft-spoken, and immaculately attired. I incorporated his book, Empire of Love, Histories of France and the Pacific, which is a collection of essays about French colonial, emotional, and imaginary encounters in Tahiti, Wallis and Futuna Islands, the Society Islands of French Indonesia, New Caledonia, into my History of Gender and Sexuality courses. The year previous to the Pacific Coast branch meeting, Matt had produced a new book, Pacific Worlds, A History of Seas, Peoples, and Cultures, a comprehensive history that extends from the Neolithic to modern eras, conceptualizing the Pacific as civilizations without centers, rather than being seen as a vast ocean geography navigated by European or Pacific Rim powers. We had lunch together in Denver, and Matt talked to me about the rewards and the challenges of moving into interdisciplinary scholarship as a historian working closely with anthropologists, archaeologists, linguists, and indigenous scholars, each of whom approached the Pacific with their own questions, assumptions, methods, and agendas in the production of knowledge. Matt has taken a leading role in the construction of interdisciplinary knowledge about the Pacific. As the founding editor of the Palgrave Studies in Pacific Histories, which runs 7 volumes and counting, co-editor of the collective Cambridge History of the Pacific Ocean, which is scheduled for release next year, as well as his own forthcoming book, Genetic Drift, Genealogies, Genomes, and Histories of the Pacific, a study of politics, science, and decolonization in Oceania. So please let us welcome this year's Western Society for French History keynote speaker, Matt Matsuda.
Thank you, Robin. You see, I'm so very sharply dressed, too. Thanks also to, of course, to the organizers and to the assembled members here, to the society itself. It's good to be, as we say, once again, parmi les historiens. I'd also like to sort of recognize as historians where we are. I know that a number of my colleagues have also recognized this, and I thank Jill for providing the text from the University of Victoria that we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhi, Esquimalt, and Hussanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. This is where we are. We just heard that we are on an island. Islands actually figure quite largely in what I especially am very committed to, and a number of you also. The geography is actually quite interesting. And I think more than simply, acknowledging and gesturing to the acknowledgement, as historians, perhaps we should talk a little bit about this. Partly because after this we will be having a reception, unless I'm mistaken, still correct. We will be going to the Royal Museum.
Unfortunately, it's here at the hotel.
It's here at the hotel. Okay, so we'll be having a reception here. But if we were going, this is what we would see, right? We'd be going to the Totem Hall, we would go to the people of the Nass River, and we would see basically the way in which this knowledge is being constituted curatorially in this region, continuing artistic traditions, and especially a vibrant and living culture, which is very, very important in these kinds of histories. You may know if you just travel a little bit up the island to about where the middle of it's quite a big island, of course, Vancouver Island, a little bit further north. If you head up there, you come to the home of the Nutrilmuth people, called Nootka in the English version, post Captain Cook and many of the British, the Spanish, the French, and the Russian explorers of the time, and the history, which includes the great chiefs like Maquina on the left there, who at one time controlled much of the fur trading in this region all the way to Canton in China. So this is a widely and vastly linked part of the world through the indigenous peoples. In popular history, of course, if we think about French names and French experience, you may recognize Toussaint Charbonneau, part of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Lewis and Clark, famously commissioned by Thomas Jefferson because of something that Napoleon Bonaparte did, sail the Louisiana Purchase, which charted a route for the United States at that time, growing toward the Pacific. He's actually best known for one of the girls he took as his wife, Sacagawea. You may also know that where we are, British Columbia, this is, of course, Vancouver Island. We're down here. That it's historically called New Caledonia, which is very interesting if you're a Pacific historian, because New Caledonia, Nouvelle-Calédonie, or Kanaki, means something quite different in the way that Pacific historians, when they hear Nouvelle-Calédonie, they think about the Kanak lands in the southern Pacific, very near to the northeast coast of Australia. So to sort of connect some of these, I want to talk a little bit about Pacific Island histories. And I want to sort of tie this back first with a little story about the early settlement of the Pacific Islands. This is an illustration by the famed Hawaiian illustrator and historian Herb Kawainui Kane, for a series that he did back in the 1960s and 70s mostly, in a long career. But at that time, it was not known really how it was that Polynesian peoples had settled islands as far-flung as the Hawaiian archipelago, which is really in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Rapa Nui, Easter Island, all the way down to Aotearoa, New Zealand, in what's the famed Polynesian Triangle. It seemed impossible for peoples without Renaissance European sailing technology to be able to navigate the open ocean like that, across thousands of miles, often weeks or months at sea. And this was deemed to be an impossible feat for anyone who didn't have a sort of modernist European capacity in navigation. And it was also part of the history. It was part of a colonial history, which said that island peoples were isolated. Perhaps they had drifted there. Perhaps they had clung to logs. Perhaps they'd been brought or dropped off by European ships. Or perhaps they were parts of a sunken continent, and the islands were simply the tips of the mountains, which had now, the rest had all disappeared. But to argue that you actually could navigate in the open ocean 1,000 years before Europeans could do it seemed quite impossible. So there's actually no way to demonstrate this historically. And so in the mid-1970s, along with a lot of the other kind of cultural ferments and revolutionary and decolonization kinds of thinking that I've been hearing about in wonderful panels all through the sessions today, they got together and they said, we have to have a different kind of history. We will sort of enact our history, perform our history. And we'll demonstrate that this can be done, not by doing more sort of archival study, because there weren't any archives, not by convincing people with computer reconstructions, because they weren't convincing, but by actually reconstructing a canoe and sailing it between the Hawaiian Islands and the Tahitian Islands. And that is what they did in 1976. The story is very complicated and very fascinating. But in 1976, this canoe, the Hokulea, which was created by this group of seafarers, collaboration between university people, watermen as they're called, seafarers, and also the Hawaiian Kanaka Maoli, the indigenous community, landed in Matavai Bay, in Papeete, Tahiti, and it was said that half the island came out to greet them. Now, part of the reason why I tell this story in this context is because, you can probably see why, because you have you have a Hawaiian history, which is part of American history, and you have a Tahitian history, which is part of French history. When this happened, what you had was a Polynesian history, which had nothing to do with the French and nothing to do with the Americans. And so this was a signal moment which really changed the whole, it became what became known as the Polynesian cultural renaissance. And it created a whole new revival of languages, of cultures, activism for schools, for land rights, for shore rights, for the revival of lost cultural practices. Now, the sailing of the Hokulea is also very interesting, because there's something else about it which is quite fascinating, which is that it was a performance replica of a canoe, which is to say that it was not created from traditional, quote-unquote, traditional materials that would have required koa trees in the Hawaiian Islands, these massive giant strands of koa trees deep in sort of the mountains. But unfortunately, by the 20th century, all the koa wood had been extinct for hundreds of years. Just as nobody had sailed between Tahiti and Hawaii, or Hawaii and Rapa Nui, Easter Island, or Aotearoa, New Zealand, no one had sailed that way for 1,000 years either. So the trees were all extinct. So how is one to sort of really demonstrate that a canoe could have even been built, much less navigated, over such a vast expanse? Well, the answer came from observing that although the koa trees became extinct, there were large strands of Sitka spruce trees which fell into the waters off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, and they drifted down into the Central Pacific. And many of them landed on the north shores of the Hawaiian Islands and were used for canoes. So to create a canoe, there was a second canoe which was created, the Hawaii Loa. And this canoe was created with Sitka spruce, but it wasn't just waiting for a log to float by. Nainoa Thompson and his crew, the Polynesian Voyaging Society, they got together with their group and with many of the elders of the communities and the nations and the First Peoples along the Pacific Northwest coast. And then they went to as far north as the Tlingit people up in Alaska. And they asked Judson Brown, the elder, about the trees. And he agreed that he would gift 2 very large, very old trees for the hull of the Hawaii Loa, which is this canoe here. And he considered this to be a reconnection of culture, of politics, and a sort of a decolonial statement about the possibilities of what indigenous communities could do over generations. Here we see the Hawaii Loa. This is the Hawaii Loa, basically at sea. It is actually not only a performance replica, it is actually made of wood carved by hand. The other thing that's important about this region, here we are again right here, is that you'll see for its maiden voyage, what the Hawaii Loa did was, yes, it sailed around the Pacific more broadly, but it actually, as a sign of respect, this is why I mentioned about the land recognition acknowledgement. We don't just say that. This is actually, they sailed the Hawaii Loa along the coast right past Vancouver Island, all the way up to Alaska. And if you've had a chance to ever hear Nainoa Thompson speak, what he'll say is that the trees came from here. We owe this to the communities here who supported us, who made this possible. And we started here, and then we made our way up through all the indigenous communities. But he said we only landed where we were welcome. That is, they didn't set an agenda and say, we want to come here. He said, we are sailing. If you would welcome us, our presence here, from all of the groups and the communities, they would land, and they would meet, and they would celebrate. And that's exactly what happened. Now, this is just a way to sort of talk about, there are interesting ways one can talk about what Pacific and Oceanian history are and what the French connections can be. There's also more traditional ways. This is like the core of our discipline. So I've done a lot of history like this too. The Carte de l'Océanie, we can look at the geography, we can go back to Louis XVI and with Bougainville, giving the Comte de Bougainville the instructions about how he should go and chart the Pacific, right, in the 18th century. We can also look at the archive and the notes from the Marine. These are actually a lot of the Bougainville and La Pérouse. Oh, sorry, that was La Pérouse. La Pérouse and the logs that he kept, which are wonderfully conserved. It's an extraordinary thing. We could move forward in the 19th century, look at look at some of the naval figures like Abel Aubert du Petit-Thouars, the admiral who seized the Marquesas and Tahiti for the French in the 1840s. We could go broadly. We heard some talks about this today. We could look at the Sino-French War, the Tonkin War of the 1880s, 1884. We could look at the missionary presence, like Pierre Crochet in the late 19th century. We could look at some of the cultural references. I've certainly done work like this. The fabulously popular Pierre Loti at the time with Madame Chrysanthème, and Puccini did a more famous version of this with Madame Butterfly, but it was kind of the same idea. Or you could look at the way in which the Pacific broadly writ, Hokusai, 1830, the ukiyo-e woodblocks, and the 1890s, of course, Monet and the water lilies and his Japanese garden. However, we're going to sort of focus on a little bit, use a little different lens, and this is where it's not just about cultural exchange per se, and about cultural interfluences, but more about empire, and kind of what empire might mean. So again, today, many extraordinary presentations about empire, and particularly about the troupe coloniale, and the role that the colonial empire played in sort of creating this idea, sort of like the trois couleurs, un drapeau, un empire, the idea of sort of this sort of affinity of all for the idea of French empire. In the Pacific, this manifests to a large degree and in many ways in the military and the administrative control of entire territories. This is in what is today, still known today as French Polynesia, of course, Tahiti and Moorea, the Bay de Papito. If you search for, say, Tahiti and sort of do a search for art, and you put those two keywords together, this is what you'll find. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying this is what will come up. It's Gauguin, right? The artistic version of Tahiti and what is today French Polynesia is Gauguin, and it is created by basically French aesthetics and by the representation of a certain kinds of this wonderfully ethereal, very colorful, sort of a mythic idea of what French Polynesia is. Not at all, of course, a colonial version, but very much a mythical and kind of aestheticized version. I'm not saying it's not great art. I'm just saying this is what you will get, right? Following this, okay. We'll do it this way. Again, another version of sort of how empire looks when represented, at least. This is called La Danse Kanak. This is 1889. These are, of course, some of the Kanak famed dancers and warriors. And as you might guess from the name and from the way that the illustration is put together, this is at one of the Universal Expositions. Of course, it is intended to be a representation of sort of the arts and the culture, and some would say the sort of the savagery of the colonial world. It occludes what is very famously some of the political history and colonial history, including the 1878 rebellion of the Kanak against the French rule. Many of these stories are famously about, or this one in particular, are famously about settler colonials. Were led by the famed Kanak chief Atai, and it was very much, as we saw in the sort of land recognition, it was very much about land, right? Very much about land, and the famous sort of the episode associated with him was going to the governor with two sort of sacks, burlap sacks, and dumping out a bag of soil on the governor's floor and saying, "This is what you have taken from us," and then dumping out a bag of rocks and saying, "This is what you have left us." And so the entire way in which the recognition of the land is actually very, very importantly tied up with colonial histories. the colonial histories, of course, also extend backwards and forwards. We have connections directly with French political history, La Commune, and Louise Michel. I think if you look at Carol Eichner's book, you also know that Louise Michel was one of the deportees to New Caledonia, which the French were trying to establish as a penal colony. They were terribly envious of the British, having done so well in Australia, that they wanted to have their own. They were never as good at it as the British. But there was a film about Louise Michel, made of which some of the episodes are about this relationship with the Kanak. She did support the Kanak and the rebellion. During this time, during the time that she was there, and it's been made into kind of cinematic popular culture. Now, I mentioned sea changes, and you can see a lot of this about the sea, ocean history, and so forth. And so I want to sort of do a little parallel kind of a history here. When I say sea changes, what do I mean? If you work in oceanic histories, you sort of think about what were the big signal markers of thinking about oceans as historical as opposed to natural spaces. And one of the biggest ones comes right out of French history. You all know this, but it is interesting to sort of also, as we're criticizing our discipline, to also sort of recognize the kinds of questions that it's raised over generations that have been very, very resonant and continue to this day. So ocean history didn't used to always be history. It was very much history about, what do we used to call it? The age of discovery and the age of exploration, right? It was like you just went through it and you got somewhere far away, right? It wasn't anything about like the ocean, right? Or the seas. And Brodel's La Méditerranée in many ways really changed that. He really said, about this insistent ring of seas tied to coastlands, the way the trade worked, where the local cultures intersected. This was really another way of thinking about how it was or how it could be. And one could imagine what Oceanian histories are. And many historians, myself included, have, even when we're talking about something very different, sometimes we start with Brodel and we talk about, well, how did Oceanian history become the thing that it is? Brodel, of course, also famously himself, talking about what it was that the Annales, really brought to the study of history. And maybe this doesn't need to be said, but he said, the attempt by French scholars to adapt economic, linguistic, sociological, geographic, anthropological, psychological, and natural science notions to the study of history and to infuse an historical orientation into the social and human sciences. So this actually matters a lot when one starts to think about where sort of our own ancestors, right, the genealogies of the intellectual traditions we carry forward. We also see it in like bestsellers. This part of the lecture is sort of like my sort of intellectual nostalgia thing. So when I was in graduate school, these were the things that we really thought about, right? We read Brodel, we read Montaigne, and we talked about, well, what's different about this? What's unique about this history? Why is it a bestseller, right? Looking at so Inquisition registers, trying to understand the mentalité. Does anybody even use that word anymore? Mentalité? I mean, trying to understand a kind of a history which is so sort of change, but it was about sort of local instances. It was about local communities. And it was very, very heavily developed from anthropological methods rather than archival historical methods at that time. And it was very clearly this way of trying to think through what was happening in this sort of, if you will, French encounter with the rest of the world, and then imagining peasants, right, or local villages, and then imagining villages, and what the tools were to try to understand what it was that peoples and communities that seemed indecipherable, how they could communicate with each other, and then historically through all of us. Now, as I mentioned, this is partly about myself. When I was at UCLA back in the day, I had a chance to study with Eugene Weber, and you all know his great classic, Peasants into Frenchmen. What I always found fascinating about Weber, Peasants into Frenchmen, which is about the sort of creation of the national identity, if you will, of France, and the way that sort of Paris, used the army and education, all these institutions to create this modern French identity, was how much he really relied on Frantz Fanon for some of his thinking, which is, I think, often not sort of recognized so much in the mainstream. And yet, this is what he actually says in the book, right? He says, we're talking about the process of acculturation, the civilization of the French by urban France, the disintegration of local cultures by modernity. What happened was akin to colonization. It may be easier to understand if one bears that in mind. So this history of France, about France becoming French, essentially, he thought of in many ways as a history of colonization. And he just say, Fanon's account of the colonial experience is an apt description. And he talks about how local regional, the destruction of local regional cultures is systematically pursued. So there are these interesting sort of legacies which run, of course, through anti-colonial thought, but also through very mainstream French national history, because it's being written in this period exactly when these are the questions which are coming much to the fore. So we have kind of the anthropological idea, sort of the ethnographic past as frozen, these ethnographic images from the 19th and early 20th century. And then they're dealing with this sort of updating them to sort of the Kanak political rebels and leaders like Eloy Machoro, whose own photographs are more about using his hatchet to smash the ballot boxes in what he considers to be an illegitimate election. This is a continuing political question for those of you who know what's been happening in Nouvelle-Calédonie over the past decades since this took place. There's also a question for the man who became the leader of the Front de Libération Nationale Libération des Kanak, Socialiste, the Jean-Marie Tjibaou, who led the movement and then ultimately was assassinated by those who are more. He basically signed accords which would lead to this law. Again, this is something I heard a lot about in panels today, but a long-term future process in which Kanak sort of sovereignty might be devolved, but not quite yet, right? And he just signed the accords. This was very too accommodating for some of his more militant supporters, one of whom assassinated him. But the idea of sort of having one's own history was very, very important. This is his son, Jean-Philippe Tjibaou. Jean-Philippe is very interesting. I went up to Hyungan to speak to him once, and he said that, the first thing he said to me was, he said, je suis un cannibale. And he said, I want you to know that. He said, people are shocked. I want you to say, je suis un cannibale, right? He wasn't really sort of like, I want to show you that I am a perfectly assimilated member of this community. I want you to understand who I am, right? And then he said something which I always thought was one of the best things I ever heard about the experience of living a certain kind of history. And he said, oh, so this is how it is. So we're here, and the Tongans, they come ashore, they look around, they say, good island, right? They lay down the challenge, we fight. Okay, they go away. The Fijians, they come ashore, they look around, they lay down the challenge, we fight. He says, the Europeans, they come ashore, they look around, they say, nice island, we'll take it, because nobody's here. this is how he understood the history. And if you know the history of the Pacific, and you know that if you know the history of Australia, you know that it's the British concept, but it worked very well there too. It's the concept of terra nullius, which is that we take your land because there's nobody here, right? Not because we should fight about it, or because we're better, or we're more civil. It's because there's actually no real people here doing anything valuable. That is, there's no history taking place, so we are going to make history instead. Well, that's what Jean-Marie Tjibaou was all about, making history. And that's why his form of anti-colonialism was not just like Eloy, what perhaps he felt, Eloy Machoro's sort of radical insistence, but it was based on culture too. It's this sort of, these two strands are very important to him. And so that's why in 1975, a quarter century before the year 2000, he organized Mélanésie 2000, which was a cultural festival, in which he said the whole purpose was if you remember the ethnographic photographs actually said that we are not refugees from some primitive past, right? We are living now. And that was the history that he wanted to reclaim. And the way to do that was part of politics, but a lot of it is also through culture. And this intertwining of the two is very, very significant. You can see, of course, the kind of colonial references in some of the presentations here. And again, I'll just reference this conference. He also didn't limit himself to Kanaki, to Nouvelle-Calédonie. He also aligned somewhat famously with the farmers in the Lazarac, in the south, kind of central of France, who were protesting for a decade or more against the expansion of military bases in the area, having the government expropriate their farmland for military purposes. And so he was invited by the farmers of Lazarac, and they actually gave him a piece of land. They gave him a piece of land, and there's still like a kaz, like a kanak structure there, although it's done in the Lazarac style with stone, right? And that's when Tjibaou famously went there. He stood there right in the heartland of France, and he said, "J'ai pris possession de la France," right? So he thought, well, if you guys can come where I am and say, I take possession of this land by planting a flag, I come here and I take possession of France. Why not? But there were these networks. They also worked together with Japanese radicals and farmers, rice farmers in Japan against the expansion of what today is Narita Airport. That actually did happen. But there were these global networks of anti-colonialism taking place. After he was assassinated, after the violence of the 1980s, the French government decided that they needed to do something. It's been widely debated whether it was out of guilt or out of pragmatism or out of just a desire to do something very, very cool. And so they commissioned the Centre Tjibaou in honor of Jean-Marie Tjibaou and his work. It is, as appropriate to its mission, a cultural center. It sponsors cultural programs, historical knowledge, language. If you haven't been there, you ever have a chance to go there, I recommend you go there. It is stunning. It does look like this. It was designed by Lorenzo Piano, who did Beaubourg, the Pompidou Center. And the whole idea, in collaboration with Alban Bansa and a lot of the anthropologists, was something which would reflect kind of the Kanak aesthetic, but it wouldn't be an attempt to cloyingly replicate that, but it would be modernist, and notably it would be incomplete. And that's why you see what you see here, because it's supposed to be incomplete, and because the work of culture and the work of autonomy and liberation and decolonization are always incomplete. So, ancestors. Well, different kinds of ancestors in these. We all know this one, and some of you may know the other ancestors, like from the Austral Islands. the famous A'a figure, right at the heart of where many Polynesian cultures consider their cultures to have come from. We also know other ancestors, right? Whether they are represented, in terms of the symbols that represent their culture and civilization, or those that will be not, which I guess we're not visiting now, but we can go on our own sometime. Or the sort of the revolutionary traditions and the continuing anti-colonial politics that's taking place in the Pacific. Now, decolonizing, it can't just be well-minded scholars to do that, but it has to be new voices. A lot of the voices coming out of the Pacific, Linda Tuhivai-Smith, Maori, Pele Haufa, who is Tongan, Albert Wendt, who is Samoan, literary, critical, activist figures who have been rewriting the way in which Pacific histories can be taught. So I mentioned something about new waves, Nouvelle Vague. Well, when we say Nouvelle Vague, we all know what we mean by Nouvelle Vague. We say great classics of French cinema, or Le Jour Légime, or Au bout du souffle. But there's also another way to think about Nouvelle Vague. It was new waves. So again, this shows my generational tendencies, but there were sort of new waves of history that come along every so often. And sometimes they create this moment in which you say, there's something different going on now. There's a different way history is moving, whether it's like Mono Zeus' work, or Lynn Hunt, or Jacques Le Goff with his Un autre Moyen Âge. And of course, Tyler Stovall, about whom we will say more just after I finish. I also had a chance to work with Pianora in Paris, and the resituation of history away from the grand narrative, or the universal grand narrative, into this fragmentation of multiplicities of sort of lieux de mémoire, places of memory, places of recommemoration, places where there's no big story to hold it all together, but just this endless contestation of different kinds of things that can be recalled in the Tahitian Islands, whether it's a commemoration of monuments to early exploration and French power, or now they're places which sort of reflect upon that same colonial power, whether it's the representation and re-representation of what the islands are, French figures like La Pérouse, or like Février Despont, who was the admiral who actually seized New Caledonia. I don't know why he should be on the money. But and then you have kind of generic figures, right, like Marquesan man or Kanak man, these kind of things like that, right? So all these questions continue. There's also, if you go up, this is a painting by Giraud about, it's this great feat, sort of military feat of, I heard this great talk about sort of anti-insurgent tactics. The French prided themselves on their anti-insurgent tactics, climbing mountains to defeat rebels and things like that. Or English paintings about the Queen Pomare, in a sort of moment of martyrdom as the French troops land to seize her islands in the 1840s. All these sort of re-representations of the past. Or, to this day, monuments to Puvana'a Aopa, the Tahitian nationalist, who discovered that he wasn't rewarded for all of his great service to the French during the war, and Oscar Temaru, who remains the independentist mayor of around Papeete, the sort of mourning the day when the anniversary of when Tahiti was seized by French forces. You notice that he's standing at a podium where he's put the United Nations, the drapeau there. It's quite interesting because in this speech, what he's doing is he's asking the United Nations to put Tahiti back on the list of countries that need to be decolonized. Right. So whether Tahiti is a country to be decolonized or just part of France is this continuing kind of debate. So, or other kinds of memories. Bougainville, who created he read a lot of Rousseau and said, this is like the noble savagery of the then the new paradise. The island, which actually is called Bougainville to this day, which is has been the site of a massive, almost like a civil war between the local communities and the mining companies, which are extracting all of the copper out of the ground. So what does this leave us with? This was Histoire vécue, lived histories. As I mentioned, histories that are not just read about, but lived. Again, the sailing canoes, which have reconnected the Polynesian islands to each other rather than with colonial metropoles. Canoes which are like trucks. They're not museum pieces. They're not simply symbolic. They're used in everyday life. And they also are connected with figures like Chantal Spitz, probably the best known of the Maohi, the Tahitian authors, whose fundamental work is L'île de rêve écrasée. And she has spoken often about this in interviews and in her work, and how literature is a form of anti-colonial sentiment. And of course, we fight for the freedom because we are not French. We will never be French. We are Tahitian for more than 1,000 years, and we will be Tahitian forever. When Jacques Chirac was continuing nuclear testing in the islands, we marched around the island for 6 days and 5 nights. On the last day, we reached Papeete, the day that we became a French colony. And what does it mean, these defense secrets that the government claims? It means the health of the people. For example, when in Moroa, which is where the nuclear testing is done, someone dies, automatically the doctor must be a military doctor. That's a law. The papers are secret. Even the family has not the right to know anything about the death. And the papers are secret even from the families. So the way that the colonial project continues is very clear. And it's very clear, especially, that the protests and the anti-nuclear sentiments which drive a certain kind of politics in the Pacific, and not just in Tahiti, of course. This is particularly true in the Marshall Islands. It's true in Japan. It's true in Australia. It's true in a lot of places where the nuclear testing has taken place. And at some point, there's always some kind of statement about fallout in paradise, because the paradise trope is very, very important for the constitution of the Polynesian Pacific. So when we talk about decolonization, what we often hear is about sovereignties. And sovereignty is a very, very big issue. Sovereignty movements across the Pacific Islands are very, very widespread. In Hawaii, they have been continuing very strongly certainly since the 1990s, which was like a 100th year anniversary of the seizure of the Hawaiian Islands by the American government. And of course, you can see some of the cases about how these questions continue also in New Caledonia and also in Tahiti. But when we talk about sovereignty, interestingly, sovereignty is also about French sovereignty. And that means the sovereignty of the state. And so it's important to sort of remember that France is a global power by dint of its military presence around the world. Nowadays we tend to hear a lot about the U.S. and how France has become a lesser rate power. But France, in fact, has a very large military sort of presence in the Pacific, and especially what Mr. Macron calls the Indo-Pacific, which is based around basically French colonies. And also the EEZ, the Exclusive Economic Zone. It's often not known that France has the largest exclusive economic zone in the world, 11.7 million square miles. Second only to the United States is second. The U.S. sometimes claims it's first. I don't know why they do that. They like the U.S. sometimes likes to claim it has more colonial territories. I don't know, but the French and the Americans back and forth. But the French have the largest economic zone in the world. Now, if you look at France, there's not a lot of an economic zone. If you look at the Pacific, there's a lot of an economic zone. So why does this matter? Fisheries, undersea material, what do we call those? Seabed mining, seabed mining. The deep sea mineral resources, oil and gas, geopolitics, and the ability to create restricted zones for extraction of resources. Plus strategic. Look where all the French presences are in the Pacific, right? And let's look at this for a second. This is La Pérouse. Remember we saw the picture of La Pérouse getting his instructions from Louis XVI? Here's where he went. He actually did, that's pretty impressive. Whether you like that kind of history or not, it's still pretty impressive, right? All the way to Japan, all the way to Pacific Northwest, he actually goes past Vancouver Island there, you see, right? He crosses Hawaii. He's following the routes of James Cook, the English navigator. And then somewhere around here, the Vanikoro, he disappears. It seems interesting. Vanikoro is part of the Solomon Islands today. And but the Solomon Islands, they kind of have their own ideas now today, right? Here's the Prime Minister of Solomon Islands making deals with people other than the French. The French don't like this, right? You all recognize this man. He's just taken over like half the world. The last party Congress. Especially it was very upsetting to Scott Morrison, the former Prime Minister of Australia, and we see Mr. Macron there, because some of you who follow this kind of news, you may remember that it was about a year ago, the French were about to sell 12 submarines to Australia, and then this whole thing happened with the Solomon Islands, and all this thing happened with sort of China coming in, and everybody got nervous, and the Americans and the British and the Australians got together and said, okay, we're going to buy nuclear submarines instead, and the French are out, right? So President Macron was not very happy about this, as you know. He wants French nuclear, not nuclear, but he wants French submarines in the Pacific. He doesn't want American and British submarines in the Pacific. France still maintains thousands of troops in New Caledonia, some in Tahiti, in the Pacific and in the Indo-Pacific. It is a very large military presence. This is meant to be a deterrent, they say, to China. And some of this these narratives collide with these revolutionary narratives. I mentioned the great chief Atai before, the one who had the two sacks, one with the rocks and one with the soil. He is lionized as a continuing sort of a figure of colonial resistance in Kanaki, in New Caledonia. You may know that he was actually, he was eventually killed in 1878 during the rebellion. He was decapitated. His head was sent to Paris, where it was at the Musée de l'Anthropologie and the Musée de l'Homme for quite a long time. It wasn't until 2007 that the French state actually gave back his head. This is actually in Nouméa. These are some of his descendants. They're actually reclaiming his remains as part of this memory politics of repatriation and the legacies of everything else. Some of his relatives, those of you in the back who can't read this, it just says, it was translated from the French, but I think it is a strong symbol in terms of recognizing the people who have suffered colonization or any other prejudices. So this is important. If you follow Oceanian politics, you know that what happens in Nouvelle-Calédonie, Kanaki, is a continuing process. It started in 1988 with the Matignon Accords, continued in 1998 with the Nouméa Accords. There have been 3 referendums now, 2018, 2020, 2021. There's a yes vote, there's a no vote. Should Kanaki, should New Caledonia be independent? The independentists continue to gain percentages, but they also, in some cases, continue to boycott the vote, which leads to an overwhelming majority for staying with France. So this is a big conundrum, and the political issues continue. So the Nouvelles Histoires. What is Nouvelles Histoires? Well, we know what the old Nouvelles Histoires were. We can go back to the enfants. Anyway, whether we sort of go back to Bougainville and we sort of think about the Rousseauist version of the Pacific, the Polynesian part. Anyway, I'm just thinking about how it is that the myths and legends of sort of paradise get created, the way in which this is re-expressed through other cultural forms. Dance is not always looked upon as much as it should be, and although it sometimes appears to be sort of touristic, it is an expression of a cultural form which was basically banned since the 19th century due to colonial and missionary influence. We talked about Gauguin and the way that aesthetics have a powerful sway about the way that peoples around the world imagine what Tahitian history is, sort of not fully understanding that the Tahitian art is fully flourishing. There are many artists, there are many collectives, and there are many statements to make. There are also very world-famous artists, for example, in New Caledonia, like Denise Tivuane, and these are voices which are telling different kinds of stories. I mentioned earlier Jean-Philippe Chibal, the eldest son of Jean-Marie Chibal, the national liberation leader. In addition to what he does, which is to be chief, he also is an artist, and he's engaged especially with wood carving. Here he's making a canoe. These are sort of Kanak traditional ways of expressing what history and culture should be. These interconnected interfluences of the way that different political movements influence each other around the world are not lost in this is Ma'ohi Live, so this is in Papeete, in French Polynesia. Black Lives Matter is an international movement too. So these are all interconnected, and their representatives and delegates do speak together. And then we can sort of think again about this dialogue between the past and the present, right? The ethnographic vision of what it is or was that New Caledonia was, and the contemporary vision. You may know that New Caledonia has the fourth largest nickel mining operation in the world. It's a huge industrial complex in the island. And more than that, something else you may find very interesting to know is that the nickel is essential for electric cars. And so the Tesla Corporation, thanks to our Twitter-owning pal, Elon Musk, is desperately trying to strong-arm the New Caledonia in order to control the nickel, which he needs for Tesla cars. So if you have a Tesla, I'm just not like saying anything bad about that, but I'm just saying that just as the wars of the 20th century have been over energy, they're still going to be over energy, and they're still going to be over materials which maybe at one time seemed not very valuable, but now they're going to become more valuable, and they're still going to be wrapped up in all kinds of colonial questions as we go forward. So, where does that leave us between the ethnography and the contemporary politics? And it can bring us here. This may look familiar to you if you've seen your program. If you haven't, you can look at the cover. This is the monument at the bay, Samoris. We just sort of look at this. It's kind of an interesting example of histories that come together. So if you look at the pedestal here, so it's a number of things. This is a renovation, so it's been renovated. So once not the original monument. So it's this history redone again. If you look here about the missionaire Mariste, the Marist fathers came here, right? So this is the religious history, 1848, right? The revolutionary year in Paris. The Marist missionaries are coming to the Pacific, and they're creating trying to create a Christian imperium. In the bottom placard, what you'll see is the Tirailleurs mort pour la France. This is for the Great War. So it is a sort of a religious monument. It is an historical monument, recreated from, and it is a monument aux morts, all sort of encapsulated together. And it stands over the bay of San Maurice, which is perhaps might be lost on anybody, but We have our medieval histoire here. You know who Saint Maurice was? Saint Maurice was the head of the Theban legions. Famously, at least in church history, a Christian. Famously, not willing to persecute other Christians, although that's what the Roman Empire wanted. And famously, he died along with his men rather than persecute others. So this is sort of the way that the story is told. He's also regularly portrayed as a black African. This is very interesting, particularly in this context. So this is the kind of image that you can recognize. There's a reason why it's on the cover of your program. There are a lot of histories there. So as we kind of wind down here, just before I showed you we talked about Chantal Spitz, the Maori Tahitian writer and poet. One of my colleagues, the Maori scholar Alice Tepunga Somerville, sort of worked with her work, talking about she washes away dirt by writing. That is the stain of colonialism. And Chantal Spitz has a number of interesting interventions, from a discours prononcé to the Assemblée nationale de Tahiti. This is one of them. Nous sommes là pour les mots pour faire l'acte d'histoire, d'historicité, des mots pour réouvrir nos mémoires, et les mots pour dire l'histoire gorgée de nos sensibilités. Right? It is for we to reappropriate our memories, right, and the history which is our sensibilities, right, or more simply, une histoire notre, right, other than les vérités historiques académiques estampillées et référencées, labellisées, dites depuis de 150 ans par une litanie de brillants spécialistes formés aux universités de la République. So it's like, there's your brilliant academic history, and then there's our history, which is our lived history, right? And so we are there to resist that history, right? Toujours dit au filtre des critères français, filtre d'une pensée arrogante, et s'auto-impose une mission civilisatrice sur les laïcités de l'esprit missionnaire. So the missionnaire part of it is kind of where I want to kind of leave us today. This is from the archives in Nouméa, but I always found this picture very arresting, because it's, as it says, La Passion Saint-Louis, which is one of the church communes there, the scene of the crucifixion. And there are different ways, there's so many ways to think about what one could sort of find in an image like this. I'm never quite sure which one is a good one to think about. One is that it's about this interesting assimilation to a Christian faith. Another way, because it's all Kanak actors and performers, is to sort of understand the Passion Saint-Louis, that this is fundamentally a story about the the persecution and martyrdom of an empire. And so when you think about that, all the layers that can come together really change the meaning of what otherwise would be a prosaic kind of a church scene. And that, I think, is partly why it's very important always to come back to these, the ways in which we have these French histories and oceanic histories, and why it's important always to be moving forward on these, these new waves and these changes that take place. Thank you.